Well, Karen Parr, thank you so much for hosting us in the Raven Landing Library, building and a project that you were foundational for, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But you've had such an interesting and varied life. I want to start back where you were born, which was Oakland, California. Is that right?
That's right.
What was Oakland like? What were your earliest recollections of Oakland?
I actually grew up in the Bay Area near Oakland, in El Cerrito and Albany. And it was just a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. A lot of kids on the street. We had a rented house like everybody else, pretty much. And had a very happy childhood.
Mm-hmm. I understand you were something of a ringleader when it came to like neighborhood productions. Is that right?
Well, we did that some, yes. We used to put on talent shows.
And who led those talent shows?
I don't remember, honestly. I might have been part of the leadership.
Yeah, something tells me you might have been. I think that's what I heard. But your dad then, when you were about, what, 6 or 7, got a job down with Lockheed?
I was 9. Yeah, it was right before the war broke out. It was right before Pearl Harbor, about 8 months before Pearl Harbor.
So Lockheed must have seen something was brewing.
Lockheed was gearing up. They were definitely gearing up. They were producing aircraft like crazy and designing new ones.
Well, now, that, of course, a prestigious job like that, what did your dad do?
He was in human resources.
Was he?
They didn't call it that, but that's what he was in.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and of course, when the war does begin and factory and manufacturing gears up, human resources would be important because you see this massive influx.
The whole thing was just boiling, yes. And they moved him twice while he was with Lockheed. We were living in Van Nuys, then we moved to East Los Angeles. Then they moved him again, and we lived in Burbank. Wow. And all of that in the space of 2 years.
Amazing. Well, and from that experience, his work at Lockheed, he eventually bought a farm, is that right?
Yes, apparently that had been his goal all along. When he got out of college, he got a job and wanted to go back up to farming. He thought children should be raised on a farm.
How did Karen handle moving to a farm community after being in these cities?
Well, it was a big adventure, you know, quite different from anything we had done in town.
Yeah. Well, now, since you went into education, what was the schooling like for a farming community in California in the day?
We had a little county high school, which I went into right after we moved to Fresno. And there were about 375 students in the entire high school, and run by the county. So you can get some idea of what the level of schooling was there.
And Fresno's close to Berkeley. I understand both your parents went to Berkeley.
They both went to Berkeley.
Was there ever a question, oh, I think I'll go to Stanford?
No question. That probably would have disinherited me if I'd gone to Stanford.
I think that's right.
No question at all.
Well, now Berkeley, of course, even in those days, was quite a sort of both academically rigorous, but also known for being something bohemian-like. What was the UC Berkeley like when you were there?
It wasn't as bohemian when I went there as it became later. We had one girl in our dorm who was a professed communist, and she was definitely an outlier. We were pretty, I think, conventional.
You studied English as your degree, or what was your major?
Well, I started off thinking I was going to be a math major because I had really enjoyed algebra in high school. Ha ha. Then I got into calculus, and I decided maybe not. But they make you take a variety of things, they used to. In the first 2 years, there was a general curriculum that you had to get through. You had to have a lab science. You had to have English classes. You had to have a foreign language. You had to have some kind of social science. And so you had to sample things. And I thought this was very good. We had to sample things that we might not have taken.
But of course, when you're in there, which would be the late 40s, I'm guessing.
That's right, 1948.
What were the career options for women in those days?
Well, for career, women were expected to get married and raise children, and when they did that, they would leave the workforce. That was the general expectation. And that was expected of me too. It didn't happen, but that's what. But it was a good idea, my parents counseled me, to have a profession that I could go to if I needed to. I could, my husband could die, or we could get divorced, or things could happen. And I might have to support myself. And so the choices were nurse, secretary, or teacher for women in those days. Well, that was a no-brainer. I chose teaching.
Yeah, but I want to talk a little bit about that teaching, because as I understand it, you and your father had a shared love of language and verse. Is that right?
Yes, we did. Yes, and music.
And music.
Yes.
And did you trade poems at one point, or quips, or how did that?
He used to, when I went away to college, he used to occasionally write me something in verse. And I remember in one in particular, which I have saved. It was a reprimand I had written in a letter that we wrote letters in those days.
Yeah, what an idea.
What an idea. When phone calls were expensive, you know, if you called on the phone, it was an emergency. But I wrote to him about getting in late or something from a date or some minor thing. So he gives me this elaborate poem about how disappointed he is that he thought he'd raised his daughter better than this. And what was she up to that night? And so I happened to be taking Shakespeare and kind of immersed in it. Like if you read a lot of Shakespeare, you sort of get like you breathe it. Mm-hmm. So I wrote him several lines back in Shakespearean style English, protesting this imputation of my morals. And he was thrilled with it. He actually thought it was real Shakespeare. He and my aunt sat up for hours trying to find it in the complete works of Shakespeare.
That's great.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. Well, I want to talk, something you mentioned about your college, the variety of courses that you had to sample and take. And since I know you became an educator, it strikes me these days that oftentimes people look at colleges as fashioning careers and only careers.
Exactly. It's a big mistake.
I always thought of it as a rounding out of character, sampling a broader perspective.
Sampling the world. I went from a graduating class of 75 kids, most of whom were farm kids, into Berkeley. It was a whole new world. There were foreign students there. I got to know Arabs and Chinese, and we had perspectives from every bit of the spectrum, from very far right to far left. And we had generally very good instructors for the freshman classes. Quite often in those days, the department head would teach the freshman class. There'd be 900 kids in the class in a lecture. But he was a fascinating person. Yeah. And his goal was to recruit students into that field, which worked sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Well, and I think about the fact that for a lot of kids who grow up maybe in a small farming community, or maybe not, the exposure to new ideas is rare. And so a value of college is suddenly having your assumptions challenged.
That's exactly right. And just the whole huge menu of things to learn. It was so exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, in high school, we had expurgated Shakespeare. All the naughty words were edited out. In college, we got the real thing.
Yeah.
And I also joined the women's chorus called the Glee Clubs, the Treble Clef Society. And the men's was called the Glee Club. And we did a lot of concerts together and a lot of shows together. And that was really fun.
But I have to ask you, when you finally left college and took your first teaching job,
Yes.
I wonder how useful all that education proved to be. It was in a 2-room schoolhouse in Oregon.
That's correct.
Yeah, tell me how you made that transition from college into a 2-room.
It was rough. I mean,
Yeah, I'd imagine.
the universities, and it's still going on to some extent, I think, but they're trying to change this. The universities would fill the education students full of theory. We studied John Dewey, and we studied theory of child development, and it did not tell us how to handle a whole bunch of kids in a classroom all day long.
Yeah.
What do you do with all these kids?
And since it's a 2-room schoolhouse, you taught all or many
Multiple
grades.
yes.
Yeah, that must be tricky.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
So you just kind of wing it. I had grades 4 through 8 in that first classroom.
Wow, that's quite a spread because the kids are maturing and changing, and their whole outlook must differ from grade to grade.
The good thing was that there weren't that many. I mean, I think they were under 20 in the classroom. Not much more than that, for sure.
Well, I'm going to ask you more about your theory about teaching and education when we get on a little bit, but you weren't there in Oregon too long before you started teaching for the military.
That's right.
Talk to me about that.
Well, a friend of mine had done it. I wouldn't have thought I'm just copycat. I wouldn't have thought of applying to the military to teach overseas, but when a friend did it, I thought that seemed like a good idea, and I applied too. Wound up in Germany.
Did you have a choice on which military posting you'd receive?
No.
So it was, you could have ended up in Timbuktu.
Well, wherever there might be an army, it was the army that accepted me. Any place there's an army base big enough to be running a school for the dependents.
Yeah.
So Japan and Germany were major ones. England also, Italy.
Well, all right. So in Germany, this is where you met Charlie.
That's right.
Yeah. Tell me about that meeting.
It was my second year of teaching in Germany. I had transferred to Bremerhaven from the first posting was a little tiny town in the center of Germany. And Bremerhaven had a much larger army base. They actually had 2 6th grades in the school. And in my class, there was this little boy named Chipper Parr. And in the other 6th grade, his twin brother, Charlie Parr. And their daddy came to PTA, he says, to meet me.
Well, there has to be some motivation besides your kids, I guess, to go to PTA meetings, huh?
So he was a widower with 3 partly grown kids.
Well, I'm going to take a moment and talk about Charlie because he had a really remarkable life too, and you two shared so much when you became married and came up to Fairbanks. He served in the 10th Mountain Division, didn't he, during World War II?
He did. He was in action in Italy.
And yeah, some tough action.
It was tough action.
Yeah.
He got a Bronze Star. They were pushing the Germans north gradually along that highway that runs along near the west coast of Italy, and tunnel after tunnel after tunnel along Lake Garda. And the Germans would wait until the tunnel was full of American soldiers and then blow it up. It was a really
Very brutal.
Brutal, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the 10th Mountain Division is such an elite corps that it's quite a feather in Charlie's cap that he was.
Yeah, he was recruited for that early on.
But he didn't come from mountain stock, did he?
No. He did have to take ski lessons. Never really liked it that much. And he didn't need skiing in Italy.
No, I guess not. You know, you'd have to be high in the mountains to use that skill. The other thing, though, that I know is that when you met Charlie, he was an officer in military intelligence.
That's right. First, they sent him to officer candidate school. Well, first warrant officer school, and then officer candidate school. And then they sent him to Detachment R, which is Regensburg, Germany, where they had set up an immersion course in Russian, staffed by white Russians who had escaped from Russia and were teaching there. And so they were speaking Russian from 6 weeks in, they never spoke English again. The whole thing was taught in Russian.
And of course, at this period, it's the height of the Cold War.
That's right. They were, there was really a lot of tension between the United States and Russia at that time. And they were looking to find out what was going on. And so, with the Russians. And so they trained him as an intelligence officer.
This might be jumping the gun, but when you two were married and he was still serving, there must have been a certain amount of secrecy. He really couldn't divulge what some of his operations were.
He could not divulge anything about what he was doing, and he never did. Even after it was all over, years later, he said, I didn't need to know.
But I'm thinking that must be tremendously nerve-wracking because you don't know, you know, if he's going over to East Germany.
He didn't, well, I assumed it was East Germany, but he would just be gone for 3 days or 5 days.
Well, let's talk about the marriage. Now, you sort of, when you and Charlie, as you mentioned, he had these 3 children. He's a widower. And so you had a ready-made family. Was that difficult? I would think that would be kind of emotionally fraught.
Well, it was wonderful for me. I'd always wanted children, never had any. And these were nice kids. He had done a very good job. These were, especially the little girl who was just darling, very sweet. And I fell in love with the kids actually before I did him.
Really?
Yeah. So there were, of course, we had our times. New stepmother and
sure,
working things out.
Right. Well, and I'm sure in certain respects, let's say, I think you said your cooking was better than Charlie's. So there must have been some positive they saw in you.
They said that was a positive, yeah. His cooking was okay, but he had a limited repertoire.
And then, of course, for a young girl growing up, having a mother's a pretty important deal, I would think.
It was, I think, yeah. I was able to make clothes for her and fix up her bedroom pretty, like a little girl should have. And
when Charlie left the military, where did you two have a discussion? You came up to Fairbanks pretty quickly after service, right?
We did. He had 3 more years to finish his 20 years service with the Army when we got married. So we just kept renewing in Germany because we were fine there, especially after he stopped being an active intelligence officer. So when it was time to retire, the Army will send you once anywhere in the world that you want to go, and then that's it. And so he kind of called a family council and he said, you know, I've always wanted to go to Alaska, the kids and me. What do you think? And we all kind of looked at each other and shrugged. We didn't know anything about it. Yeah. And said basically, well, we'll try it. The road goes both ways. If we don't like it, we can leave, right?
But college was also a big draw for him, wasn't it?
He absolutely wanted a college education so badly he could taste it. He'd had a lot of training in the Army, but never been to college. And he wanted to go someplace that he could get his bachelor's degree.
So the story goes that he flew up and Mom and the kids drove up the Alcan.
Yes, he had to make the date, the final deadline for late registration. I think it was September 25th. And we couldn't get out of the Army any sooner than that because of their schedule, the Army's schedule. So the kids and I at that point were visiting my parents. When we got back from the Army, I had yet to meet his family. He had yet to meet my family. And so that was the first order of business. And so we drove up from Fresno, California, in an old Dodge fluid drive car, which we'd bought in Germany, fourth hand or whatever. And 3 kids and a dog. And I was the only driver. The boys were not quite old enough.
How did you maintain sanity? And you must have been on a budget too.
Well, we camped a lot. We camped mostly. It was rugged. I mean, they're just kids.
Any breakdowns?
We did not. We had extra tires, but we did not have a flat tire. The muffler kept falling off, and I would send one of the twins under the car to put it back on again.
It's times like that the kids become handy.
They're very handy, yes.
Yeah.
The last night was so cold that I actually sprung for a motel on our last night out. It had started snowing. It had been snowing for 2 days, and we had put the chains on the car, but it was still, the chains broke from where?
So you're driving pretty slowly.
We were driving pretty slowly, ka-thunk, 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 when we got to Fairbanks.
This is before texting and emails. How did you and Charlie, did you have a phone number you could call them, or how did that work?
We didn't know anybody here, and there were no cell phones. So I said, well, I'm sure there's an Episcopal church in town. We checked. It's just tell the priest at the church where you are, and I'll call him and find out where you are.
Smart.
And we did that. It worked, and it turned out he was a half a block away from the drugstore where I make the phone call.
So here's this guy out of the Army pursuing a degree at the university. He obviously probably has to provide food for the table and a roof over your head. Yeah. What was life like for you two in those early days in Fairbanks?
Well, it was close financially. His total take-home pay for the Army for retirement was $300 a month. We had saved up roughly $1,000, which was a lot of money for us in those days. So he took 21 credits every semester. He was at the university, and he got a part-time job at the B&M grocery in Lomita. And by the way, his first boss there was Billy Innes, and she's here at Raven Landing now.
No kidding.
Yeah.
How exciting.
Yeah. And then we were only a block away from Maine Junior High School, and so I got substitute jobs whenever I could. It was too late to get a regular job.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that educational piece, because of course you were trained as a teacher. What was the school district like, and what was your first assignment? You were in Salcha, weren't you?
That was the last one.
That was the last one?
Yeah, well, we were right close to Maine Junior High, and I did subbing the rest of that school year, and then I got hired for the next, and I taught at Maine for, I think, 3 years more after that.
Over time, education must have changed a good deal. What was the standard at that point when you were teaching?
The standard?
In the sense that, I mean, did you have, were things broken out in grades? Did you have only one class? Were you taking multiple classes? Of course, as a substitute, you took other things, but when you actually became a teacher?
Well, junior high then was like a miniature high school. That was the general idea. And the kids changed classes every hour. And I taught mostly math the first year because they were short a math teacher. And then the second and third year I taught all English. And so we'd have about 30 to 32 kids to a class, and so I'd teach 6 classes a day.
I have to observe that Charlie, after he got his bachelor's, went straight through and got a master's.
That's correct. He got his bachelor's in 2 years by taking all those credits, and he challenged some classes, took them by exam, because he had done so much reading in his life, but by that time he was already working part-time for the university, teaching classes in Russian and German.
Boy, so I want to just stop. He's working part-time, he's taking a full course load, more than a full course load.
Right.
He's teaching as well.
Right.
Did you guys ever talk to each other, or was he always in a book?
Well, then he would come home from working at the grocery store at 10 o'clock at night, and he'd have to sit down with our daughter, who was having a terrible time with algebra. And we got to the point where she wouldn't even speak to me, so then he had to take over.
You pursued a master's degree too, didn't you?
Yes, I found out that, of course, that teachers' pay depended on longevity and education, and so the master's degree would put me up a notch on the salary scale.
Well, Karen's teaching a full load. You must be taking evening classes then for your degree?
Yes, I did. Yes,
Yeah.
I did.
Well, how did that work out?
I was generally pretty tired by the end of the day because I was on my feet. By that time, I was teaching grade school. They transferred me to Hunter. And I would go to school all day, be on my feet all day, and then go to a class that started at 5 p.m. It was really, really hard to keep awake, even though I had a wonderful professor. So I finally screwed up my courage and asked for permission to knit during class to help keep awake, explained my problem, and she let me do that.
Yeah, and I understand this professor was pretty much a drill sergeant.
She was a martinet, not unreasonable, but she was very, very disciplined herself, and she really knew her field, and she was a no-nonsense person, and a little bit scared of her. Yeah. They were the wonderful classes. The first was the history of the English language, and the second was a class in Chaucer.
Talk to me a little bit about the university in that day, but of course, we're celebrating you being an alum to UAF. What was campus life like then? This would be in the 60s then, right?
Yeah, it was the 60s. Not that different. We didn't have the Fine Arts building, the classes, and we also didn't have the Eielson building. So the classes were mostly in, we had the Eielson building. What we didn't have was the, what's the 7-story one in?
Greening?
Greening, it didn't have Greening.
Right.
It was like college anywhere. It was just, there wasn't anything remarkable.
Well, what I'm thinking about is so often we talked about UC Berkeley and life then and the Glee Club and whatnot. Yeah. When you're an adult, a family person.
Oh yeah, you don't have time for that.
You don't have much time.
No, you just go to class and come home and cook dinner,
But in many ways, I want to say you and Charlie really are the typical student for a UAF because it has never been a traditional student structure.
That is correct, yes.
So it was accommodating in that regard, I would guess.
It was, there were lots and lots of teachers taking extra credits at the time. It was just the thing to do.
Now, Charlie wanted to continue his degree and get a PhD, didn't he?
Yes, because he thought he would continue teaching at the university for the rest of his career.
So where did he pursue those studies?
Yeah, well, he wanted to get a PhD in humanities. His thing was languages, obviously. They didn't have any such thing at UAF. And so he took a year off, took a year's leave of absence, and went to Florida, to Florida State University at Tallahassee.
So while you're outside, though, the Fairbanks flood occurs.
It did.
Yeah. And was your house affected?
Yes, the house was completely flooded. It was like 42 inches on the main floor, and everything we owned was in the basement.
So you lost a good deal.
We lost a great deal.
Yeah. But I understand from that flood, you had an opportunity to do one of your favorite jobs ever. Can you explain pretty much the loss of text for math? Yeah,
the flood wiped out most of the textbooks in the district because most of the schools are on low ground in the center of town. They had been about to adopt modern math. Would you remember modern math?
Oh, I sure do, because I experienced it.
Yes, well, it was all the new thing. And They were going to get that the year following the flood, but they had to replace all the textbooks anyway. It didn't make any sense to buy a bunch of textbooks for the old math and then have to change them the next year. So they bought all modern math textbooks to replace these. And then there was no time for the teachers to learn how to teach this. It was quite a different approach. Because the flood was in late August and the school was already getting ready to start. They delayed it for a week or so, but that's all.
So what was the solution?
The solution was they had a federal grant to try instructional television in Fairbanks. And they decided that modern math might be one of the topics because it would have the double advantage of helping to teach the children this new approach to mathematics and also demonstrate to the teachers how to teach this stuff. It's just such a different approach.
And they tapped you to do one of the shows?
Yes, they did, yeah.
So tell me about the early days of instructional television, Karen.
I wasn't there, I didn't do it the first year, but I did it the second year. And this math class was aimed at third grade. I used the third grade textbooks, and I had to, of course, read up on this method too. And I got to design the whole course myself. It was really, really fun.
So how did you teach modern math techniques and principles?
Well, television was a very good medium for that. We had 3 cameras, and we didn't have all of the special effects they have nowadays, but we could do a certain amount of special effects by inserting the picture from one camera into another camera.
Oh.
And so we did a certain amount of that, and we used those tricks to get the children's attention. I had a puppet designed by Marilyn Gentleman and also voiced by her. It was a salamander puppet. We decided the name of the course was Sets and Salamanders. And so she built Spike Salamander and moved him from behind the board, and he was a smart aleck. The kids loved him. He always knew the answer before anybody else, or he thought he did. It was really a lot of fun.
It sounds like it would be a lot of fun. Did you get letters, or what kind of reaction did the people?
The children really responded. They sent me pictures of Spike Salamander, lots of pictures of Spike Salamander, and notes about it. I used to do a little online quiz every week, 5 questions. And they would do it in the classrooms, and the teachers would send their papers in to me, and I would get them graded and send them back. But it was really quick.
Well, was there any way to gauge how successful the televised?
But besides the general interest of the kids, and the teachers liked it too, of course, that something new, a break for their day.
Sure.
But the math scores for the third graders of that year were spiked way higher than our math scores for the Fairbanks schools were below average for elementary school in Fairbanks in those days. And when they got the scores for the standardized tests at the next year, that group of kids spiked in math.
Wow.
Which was, I thought, an indication that you could use this method. Of course, the school board canceled the program.
Of course, it was innovative and successful. Why would you keep it?
And when the federal grant ran out, they just canceled it.
But I think something that you touched on earlier, and this represents, is kids, I think, don't mature at the same rate. They're not always intellectually or emotionally prepared at the same, even though they may be in the same cohort, they may not actually be ready for school at that level.
That's right. And I knew this I knew this from the beginning. This is one of the classes in college that actually was very useful. It's called child development. And I learned way back in 1949 that children don't all grow at the same rate. they don't develop at the same rate. And so you may have children who are ready to read at age 4. They're ready. They've got the brain is developed to that point, their language development is to that point. There's some children who are not ready to read until they're 7. And it doesn't mean they're not smart. It just means that they're maturing it on a different schedule. And ever since then, I've thought we should group the children by where they are maturationally instead of by their age. And we still haven't got there all these years later.
I just observed that personalized learning is a current project that the Fairbanks School District is undertaking. And in some ways, it's funny you should say this, Karen, because that is one of their goals, recognizing that not every kid at a certain age is ready for the standardized curriculum.
Teachers have known this all along.
Well, I want to also talk about, before we go into your and Charlie's political lives, talk about, you had another innovative program that you really enjoyed doing, and this one involved computers.
Yes, there was a period when I left the school district and I went to, I wound up going to Juneau while Charlie was in the legislature. And since it was nearly half a year, obviously I went and looked for work. And I wound up working with the Department of Education on a project to introduce the computer to the classrooms. And the state had decided that every school should have computers and the children should learn how to use them, the teachers should learn how to use them. And they picked the Apple II as the model. In those days, there were other brands that were competing for the personal computers. But they picked the Apple, and they bought a whole lot of Apple computers, and they taught me how to use it, them. Actually, it was pretty self-evident. You just read this funky little handbook, and then you just do it. So I learned how to use it, and they actually had some courses designed for the computer. And then they sent me around to the villages, a lot of the villages, with a couple of computer setups in baggage, and I got to show the teachers how to use them, how to put them together, how to hook them up, how to fix them when they went bad, because they used to do that all the time, and how to use them in the classroom.
Well, I want to break out that in a couple of ways. Number one, in those days, computers are pretty scary critters. I mean, yeah, they look like, you had to know programming, and if you touched it, it would break, or it would have some error would arise. So you had to become familiar with the machines before you could do any of that.
Well, yes. But it was really I enjoyed it because it was very logical, very intuitive. And I learned a little bit of programming, just enough to know what it was, but mostly just using these programs that were already prepared.
And the other point is that computers now are so integral to education. Did you have a sense when you were doing this, going to these villages and educating teachers and whatnot on these, that it would become such an integral part of education?
We certainly did, yes. We realized that this could be, could change education. We didn't realize how much, because they didn't have, for example, internet in those days. They didn't have email. Lots of the things that are so useful now didn't even exist then, but we knew it was going to change. And in fact, I was one of the people that started the Alaska Society for Computers in Education, the statewide organization. It wasn't my idea, but I helped. And it later became the Alaska Association for Technology in Education, because computers and television and other kinds of technology all kind of joined together to make a revolution in education. Mm-hmm. And we had annual conferences to help train teachers and principals on how to use them.
So you really were at the ground level and stayed with this through this organization, through now the quite sophisticated programs that exist today.
Yes, right.
Yeah, how
Yeah.
exciting.
It was really fun going around to the villages and showing the teachers and the students how to use those.
Were they responsive? Did they?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
mostly.
Yeah.
Teachers were scared of them, of course, but I showed them, it was just...
Tell me what you did, because I think you recounted one where you would shake something. Tell me about that.
Oh, well, we'd have these workshops for teachers, and the teachers some of them didn't want to come. I mean, they didn't want anything to do with this. And I'd take an Apple II computer. Do you remember it had a plastic lid on the top?
Yeah.
And when you pulled that lid off, the box is essentially empty. There was a very heavy power supply on one side and and a motherboard on the bottom, and that's it. So I would rip the top off and wave it around. And then I'd pass this computer around, up and down the rows. I'd put your hands on it, it won't bite you. It's just plastic.
Yeah.
And they relaxed a little bit after that.
Well, I think that's a key insight too, because so often when new technology comes on board, you're intimidated, it's something you don't know anything about, and you're afraid you're going to break it.
Afraid you'll break it, that's right.
And you brought along here a wonderful document on how to address all of those errors or problems that might arise.
Yeah, the early days.
Yeah, and it really does look like it was printed on one of those computers.
Dot matrix printer.
Yeah.
Do you remember those?
Oh, I sure do. I had a Commodore 64, you know,
yes.
and I remember those big floppy drives you kind of negotiate into the slots. And, you know, it's odd to think that my phone has, you know, like maybe 10 or 20 times more processing power than those early
That's
computers. Right. Yeah. Well, this organization is a great segue into Charlie and your civic life. He, of course, first ran and served on the Borough Assembly. Were both of you keen on politics, or did you feel like serving in that capacity was an important duty?
I felt it was important for him. It was one reason he came to Alaska. He hoped that he could get be a leader in having building a state. Alaska was only a state for 2 years before we came, and he knew that it had a stellar constitution, and he just couldn't see. He just thought it would be an opportunity for leadership here, and of course there was. So he first ran for a school board and lost. I mean, we practically barely got here. Nobody knew him. And then he did win the assembly job, and he was elected presiding officer. And then he ran for state house and got that. And that was it. That would be in, let's see, the first time was 1974. 1974. And then he was kind of nudging me to get active. He kind of nudged me about applying for that seat on the assembly that he vacated. And I didn't get appointed to that, but then the next year was when we decided that the school teachers decided they really needed a teacher on the assembly.
Yeah, I was going to say, it wasn't just Charlie who was nudging you, it was your teaching peers.
Yeah, but it was Charlie gave me the idea of actually being in a public office. I wasn't really into that.
So you successfully, though, that first term on the assembly, had a writing campaign that worked.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, the state law, I think I can make this brief. The state law had been changed that year. This would have been 1975. The state law had changed, and most of the clerks, county clerks, were not aware of some of these new provisions. So the teachers wanted me to run for the assembly, and I signed up, and a local guy named Rudy Voigt, pretty well-known fellow, right-wing person, had signed up, and it turned out that everybody except Rudy had their names taken off the ballot because of a new rule. that we had not named our treasurer within 7 days of
Filing.
filing. So we were left with Rudy being the only one on the ballot, and the teachers didn't want Rudy Voigt in that position. They wanted to get me in, so they decided to run a write-in campaign. And we ran a write-in campaign and just made it.
Yeah. Well, I only asked that story because traditionally write-in candidates don't perform, and rarely, if ever, I think you and Lisa Murkowski come to mind as two successful candidates that I know for a write-in campaign.
It's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's hard to do, yeah, because you're not on the ballot. You have to get people, the law says you have to write the name in, it has to be spelled properly, and you must also put an X in the box. So much of the campaign consisted in training people to spell luckily I've got a name that's easier to spell. Poor Lisa.
I should observe that during this period, this is quite a tumultuous period in Alaska politics anyway. All of this is taking place during the pipeline years, which were kind of wild and woolly, as I understand it. And when Charlie is in the legislature, of course, some important considerations like the permanent fund are being considered, and the mental health trust. Yes. All of these issues are coming into play. Yes. Give me a picture about what that was like for both of you.
Well, when he first went down, the state was still very poor. We did not have any oil income to speak of. And so it was a very tight budget. But as the oil money began to roll in, and then the permanent fund came towards the end of his tenure, because that's when the money started really rolling in. But he really, one of the things that he was particularly intent on was rights of the mentally ill, because it was pretty easy to throw grandma in an asylum and then you could get your hands on her estate, whether or not she was actually insane.
Right.
And so that was one of the things that perhaps went the other direction to some extent. I don't know, because it's a real dilemma what you do with people who are really not competent to take care of themselves, and yet you can't make them go into any kind of home now. And so they just walk around they just subsist on the streets until they die, basically. But that was one of the things. Another thing he was really intent on was human rights. That was always his big thing, was human rights, and particularly rights of women, which I certainly approved of. The Title IX Act had passed the U.S. Congress, and he was very instrumental in getting a state version called the mini Title IX passed in Alaska. So no more were they allowed to spend all their money on boys' athletics. They had to spend a similar amount of money on girls' athletics. Big change.
Big change.
A big change. We wound up having a couple of granddaughters in Juneau who were fine athletes. They never would have had a chance to play.
And I think about the Molly Hooch decision and the role of education in the rural communities. So really remarkable events are taking place, because in the early days, of course, it wasn't that way. There wasn't a school in many villages.
The BIA was running most of the schools in the villages at one point. And then the state was taking over some of them. They had a statewide system for the ones the BIA didn't run. It was a hodgepodge.
Yeah.
But they didn't have their own school districts.
Here in Fairbanks, of course, you ran several campaigns and served not only in the 70s on the Assembly, but then later in the 90s.
That's right.
Yeah. And what was the difference? Well, it always strikes me, having observed the political scene, some issues stay the same, right, but others come and go, and they really dominate for a while.
Yes.
Will anything stand out in your mind for your terms?
Well, one thing that stays the same is land issues. We have zoning here. It's not very much zoning compared to most places, but where are some rules as to how you can use your land, and there are a number of people in Fairbanks who think that the government should not have any say at all in how you use your own property. So there's always this tension that goes on between a zoning law and a landowner who wants to do something different, or between the landowner and his next door neighbors because he's doing something obnoxious.
I'm going to come back, but that's a wonderful segue to Raven Landing. One of your huge accomplishments, Karen, was after you left the assembly, but starting this community that has become so important to so many seniors and those who want to live a quality life towards the end of their years. What put the idea in your head for this wonderful place?
Pure selfishness.
Enlightened self-interest.
Enlightened, well, I hope enlightened. My friend and I, both widowed, both retired school teachers, were having lunch. My friend is Marianne Eininger, who used to live here. And we were talking about what we were going to do when we got older, and when we couldn't live alone anymore, or shouldn't at least. And we talked about the Pioneer Home and so on, and realized that there really wasn't much here. The Pioneer Home had this long waiting list. And also it had turned more into an assisted living facility than an independent living facility. So we talked about, eventually decided that we should try to get an independent living community here for seniors in Fairbanks. We looked around and there wasn't anything much in this whole state. So her parents had been in a place that was successful in Minnesota. My parents had been in a place that they really liked in California. So we had those kind of as starting points. And first we tried to get a commercial. We talked to Fountainhead.
Tim Cerny.
Ken Cerny, and said, you know, we really need this in Fairbanks. He said, well, it's not going to happen, he said, because the companies have had a look at Fairbanks market, and they've decided they couldn't possibly make a profit here because expenses are too high. And so we talked it over and decided, well, we had other friends who were interested too, decided, well, if we can't make a profit, then why don't we start a nonprofit? We knew that some of these places were nonprofit. So we learned more about it and started holding public meetings every month. We held a public meeting open to anybody who wanted to come every month for 10 years.
Wow.
And advertised it in the paper, you know, in the events column. And so everybody's welcome. So we all had a lot of input from other people and what they wanted. And I think that's one of the reasons it turned out well.
You had such big hurdles to surmount in order to realize it. Land use being one of them.
Yes.
The site was
finding the
difficult
site,
to secure.
that was very difficult.
Yeah.
We wanted to be right in the middle of town. We knew that from our attempts at budgeting that we would need to have around 100 apartments or close to it in order to be able to afford the meal service. You can't have a whole kitchen and so on for just a handful of people. They couldn't afford it. And so we knew we needed about 5 acres, and finding 5 acres in the center of town we didn't want to be on the outskirts. People suggested we buy cheap land out in Fox or Esther or North Pole. But we didn't want to be that far away because it would make it more difficult for people to come and see us and take us places when we no longer could drive.
And participate in the rich kind of cultural life that Fairbanks enjoys. Exactly.
And then the other thing that was more or less accidental, we found out that the HUD housing absolutely forbade financing. They would not finance anything that included a dining room. Well, we considered meal service absolutely essential, because one of the things that older people tend to do is not eat right, because it's too much trouble to cook properly. So they need social life. If they're all isolated, that's not good for them. And they need help with certain things, and shelter, someplace safe. And then they need meals. So we thought we'd have to put the dining room in a separate building. And in order to finance that, we would have to, HUD wouldn't finance that, obviously. I started lobbying the legislature as a capital project for a community center, but you couldn't just have it for 100 people. It had to be for everybody. And so we said, well, we'll open up this community center to the entire town and invite everybody here. And that has been, it was a thing out of necessity, but it turned out to be an absolutely wonderful feature, because now we have concerts and young people, we have baby showers, we have, last night we had the most wonderful cello concert. Everybody open to everybody, and we have all these, our dining room is full of teenagers and babies and little kids running around, especially on Sunday brunch time or Friday brunch. And we have had a high school prom here. We have had many weddings and many memorial services and other sorts of, we had political meetings. We've had plays.
It's become really a hub, an important hub for community activity.
And part of the reason that we needed to do this was we had to have a catering service. We had to be able to provide meals so that we could help pay the cost of the separate building. That was the other half of it. If the 120 or so people live here now, if we had to share the cost of the upkeep of this building in addition to their own, we would have to raise the rent phenomenally. And a lot of people living here couldn't afford it.
I know you had to go in, you had to lobby not only the state legislature, but the assembly. I think I heard your testimony more when you weren't in office than when you were trying to get this.
And that's right. We get the assembly to approve it. The city had to approve it, because this land that we wanted to use, that was underneath Fairview Manor, was actually city land. And they had leased it out to these developers. So first the developers had to be bought out of that lease, and then the city had to agree to sell it to us. It was quite a process. It took years and years.
Yeah, but what a marvelous outcome.
It was. It turned out really well, didn't it?
So I want to talk about that cultural life, because both you and Charlie have served and captured so much about it. He wrote a wonderful book about theater in Fairbanks called Backwoods Broadway.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, what was that impetus? Was he always interested in theater?
He got interested in theater when he was courting me.
So you were more than just a teacher.
I've always enjoyed being on stage, as you can imagine. I was cast in a wonderful town at the time he was courting me. So I would have these rehearsals several nights a week, and he would come and be there. He called himself a stage door Johnny. And then when production came, he took tickets and ushered and did various parts. And he got pretty interested in theater, amateur theater. When we were transferred to Frankfurt, they had a regular little theater going, and we were both active in it. Actually got him to be in a couple of plays.
No kidding.
No kidding. Do you remember Bell, Book, and Candle?
Sure.
He played the drunken author who shows up in the second act. It was really funny. And he played the sheriff in Cactus Flower? Can't think of the name of the play now, but he played a sheriff in one of these Western. He was good.
Yeah.
He was fine.
And you, of course, have served on many boards. You were on Fairbanks Drama Association's fundraising.
Yes, I was fundraising.
And that's another amazing, to have that theater, because for years it was on Gaffney, and then it was performed at Pioneer Park.
Yes.
So it was so important to find a home for it.
Yes, I can't take any credit for finding that warehouse. The Pitzenbergers were the one led that charge.
Yeah.
Bought that warehouse and and turned it into a theater, working theater.
Well, Karen Parr, you've had such a rich life politically, socially, artistically, educationally. What's ahead for you?
Well, who knows what's ahead? I mean, I'll be 86 this summer, so you never know. I would like to edit my great-grandmother's memoir if I have the time in life. Right now, I still have a great deal of life memories of my own that I need to sort through. They're in boxes, and that's not good. That won't work. I've got to get pictures and mementos from 80 years of living sorted out and disposed of. But my great-grandmother was born right before the Civil War, and she didn't die until I was in college.
So you knew her.
Oh, I did know her quite well.
So there's a living connection with the Civil War.
That's right. Her father fought on the side of the North. I even have one letter that he wrote back to the family.
Wow.
As a soldier in the Civil War. And her memoir is just fascinating. It's not terribly literate, of course. She only got to the 8th grade. I'm not quite sure about that, but she didn't have very much. She was in a Kansas farm. And then she taught. Of course, as soon as she finished school, she was teaching. And that was an interesting part of the memoir.
I'm sure.
And then she wound up living with my grandmother, her daughter, in Fresno, California in the 40s. And she didn't die till 48, 49.
Wow, a remarkable life.
She had.
Yeah, well, so have you. So we'll look forward to that combined memoir coming out.
Yeah, it would be nice to get that done.
Yeah. Well, Karen Parr, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Well, happy to talk to you. You're a lot of fun to talk to.